Next, we're privileged, I believe, to have with us a representative of the California Task Force on Reengineering IT Procurement for Success.
You have two of us.
Thank you very much. We're doubly privileged. Ma'am, if you would identify yourself.
My name is Rocio Alvarez.
Doctor, thank you for joining us. Sir?
And my name is Dugan Petty.
Dugan Petty. Mr. Petty, thank you for joining us. Thank you for presenting the task force report.
Thank you. I have a statement I'd like to read to open up the discussion.
Perfect.
Good afternoon, Chairman Roth and Senator Berryhill. I'm Rocio Alvarez. I'm the chair of the Task Force on Reengineering IT Procurement, and I'm joined here by Dugan Petty. He's also one of the task force members. Thank you for inviting us to discuss the work of the task force. Discussion about this topic is always timely in this highly connected world that we live in. But here, we're just 10 days past the closure of the first enrollment period for the Affordable Care Act, and thus at the end of the chapter of perhaps the most infamous troubled procurement in U.S. history. It's especially a useful time to reflect on the complexities of projects such as these. These are software projects that hold promise of providing citizens with better ways to interact with government, all with the same intuitiveness one expects from an iTunes downloaded app, and they rarely cost 99 cents. Yet at the same time, if they fail, these projects can undermine public trust and confidence. The task force was charged precisely for this reason, to help the state of California identify policies and practices that would help position it to successfully procure, develop, and maintain software that will provide services to its citizens effectively and efficiently. It's important to note that it was neither the charter nor the goal of this task force to conduct a review of the 21st Century Project or any other individual project for that matter. Our goal was to discern best practices and themes that would have wide applicability to large-scale IT investments made by the state of California. Can somebody grab that? Before I cover the process and summarize the organizing logic of the task force recommendations, I'd like to recognize the members whose name you see up here on the poster board. These individuals volunteered their time and expertise to share their knowledge to help our state. They made this report what it is and made my job as chair a pleasure and really a privilege. Our task force was made up of members from the state and federal government, from higher education, from private industry and nonprofits with expertise in procurement, in law and contract management, innovation management, and more. Combined, this task force represents about 100 years of collective experience in managing the entire IT life cycle. It was truly an A-team. The task force would also like to acknowledge the assistance of Jan Ross and her staff from the Controller's Office in orienting us and providing logistical and analytical support. So we began our work in December 2012, responding to the charge from the governor and the controller to help the state identify the three things: how to hire the right vendors, get the best value from these vendors, and hold them accountable. In the course of our 6 months of work, we reviewed the best practices literature on IT procurement. We studied previous California reviews of this topic. We spoke with individuals representing every angle of the IT project landscape, from major implementation vendors like CGI, Accenture, IBM, and Microsoft, to the leadership and management teams of the California Technology Agency, to representatives from DGS and finance, and implementation professionals involved in projects large and small. While the title of the task force focuses on procurement, the task force reviewed the entire life cycle of a large-scale IT project because all members believe that in order to achieve a successful end, initial stages must be managed very carefully. Mistakes made early on can have major damaging impacts throughout the project life cycle. Therefore, our 21 recommendations cover the life cycle of these investments from initial concept and planning to closeout and lessons learned. Change the second poster. As you'll see on this other poster here, the task force identified major themes that are in the larger font there and challenges that are in the smaller font. These emerged from our data gathering and deliberations. There were 10 major challenges that the task force felt needed to be addressed in order to improve the chances of success for IT projects. These challenges clustered somewhat naturally around 7 themes. Some of these themes span the entire IT life cycle, such as governance and cultural factors. Others are specific to certain phases, such as procurement. The 21 recommendations that make up the body of our report are an attempt to comprehensively answer these initial challenges that were identified. These are based on best practices in other states, localities, or industry. Implementation of some of the recommendations require changing management practice, others revising state administrative manuals, and still others changing legislation. Wherever we could, we've identified what types of changes need to take place. While some of these recommendations are new, many build upon improvements already being undertaken by Carlos Ramos and his staff at CTA. And finally, these recommendations, some new, some not, together represent one of the most detailed and comprehensive set of recommendations provided to the state of California for improving management of IT investments and projects. Together, they provide a roadmap towards improving the way the state of California engages with technology to serve its citizens. Dugan and I welcome now the opportunity to further discuss the findings and recommendations with you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, and that's exactly what we're here for, is to try to, was not to beat up on the 21st century folks any more than we have, but to talk about what we can do on a go-forward basis in the state of California to perhaps improve our IT procurement process to the extent it needs improvement, and whether or not it needs improvement, at least try to minimize the kind of situations that we have experienced in the most recent past. Your task force report is excellent, by the way, and
Thank you.
I have reviewed it. And perhaps we could go through, if you have the time, some of the recommendations, and you could provide some insight to us on some of the comments. In looking at recommendation number 1, which has to do with modifying the feasibility study report process, restructuring the project approval process, I know one of the challenges identified was the tendency to design a system based on the functionality of the known legacy system rather than modernize. And there was another comment about ill-defined requirements leading to extreme changes. Could you talk to that for me?
Sure. This whole section here is looking at as we said, we looked at the entire life cycle of an IT project. So we wanted to look at the earlier stages of where we're involved in conceptualizing and soliciting information in the early stages. We looked at what's called the FSR, the Feasibility Study Report, and one of our recommendations explicitly suggests that you do away with the state of California do away with it because it looked like a report or a requirement that had accreted over the years or the decades. And many of the questions were at varying levels of specificity that were not appropriate for a project or were not appropriate to be answered at the early stages of a project.
Phase them, in other words.
Right. And so that was one of our recommendations, and that's actually the first recommendation that we have. The whole other section on that you mentioned on ill-defined requirements and requirements elicitation in general. I think what the task force was getting at there was looking at the tendency for large bureaucracies to try and codify their tried and true, perhaps not the most efficient ways of doing business. And so we suggested, or we recommend in that case, that the state of California seriously look at first documenting and validating their existing business requirements, and then engage in what we explicitly state here is business process reengineering to modernize those processes, so that a technology implementation project is oftentimes much more about re-engineering your process than it is applying technology to that process. As someone once said to me, if you're doing something poorly and you apply technology, you just do it fast. You do the poor thing faster. So this is these two recommendations, number 2 and 3, are trying to get at that in particular.
And in fact, you have, as I recall from the report, you have a role for, I guess, what was then called the California Technology Agency, and now is our Department of Technology. You have a role for the technology arm of state government in that process, and what was that role that you contemplated?
We didn't actually have a role for them in the business process reengineering piece of it. We didn't study sufficiently the various agencies or to understand what kind of capacity they had to implement a full-scale business process reengineering. So we recommended that the state engage external entities to help with that, and in some instances, and have the what was then called CTA oversee that, and in some instances, if an agency had already been through a process of re-engineering their workflows, that they'd be exempted from going through that, because it's a very time-consuming and costly process.
But the technology department, or the CTA at that time, the decision not to re-engineer had to be reviewed by the state
Correct.
technology agency and
Correct.
approved by that agency. So there was you intend for there to be some review
Right.
of the agency or department's decision not to take a look at its processes and modernize them and make them more efficient when appropriate.
You're right, absolutely.
Okay. Now, with respect to the re-engineering process, in your view, who does that? Does the department do that? Does an outside contractor do that? Does it depend on the nature of the system involved and the issues?
Re-engineering, doing process re-engineering is a very specific skill. That's something that, certainly you can train your staff internally to engage in that, but that's usually done by external consultants, that a consulting firm or external vendors that you engage that are skilled in doing that. Accenture, that we spoke to, does that. IBM, I mean, just about every major vendor has an arm of that does business process reengineering, closely coupled with IT implementations. Do you suggest in these cases that the State Department or agency investigate other states' best practices in this area with respect to the processes that are utilized inside the agency or the department? The task force actually looked at some other states. We looked at the state of Massachusetts. My colleague here, Dugan, is from the state of Oregon. He was a CIO there. So we also had somebody from the state of Colorado. So we really did a pretty good scan of what current best practices were available at other states. As I mentioned earlier in the opening statement, most of these recommendations are based on what other states or localities are doing, and some are from industry as well. So yes, we did look at that, and the recommendations that are contained in here come from that information.
And generally represent best practices used in other states by other agencies and departments in the states?
Right.
Interesting. Now, I noticed in recommendation, Senator Berry will just jump in any time here.
Yeah, I will.
Okay.
You're doing a great job.
Don't go that far. In recommendation number 4, you speak about strengthening market research regarding technological advances and the like pre-solicitation. And could you address that for me?
Right. When we interviewed the vendors and state staff, one of the things that we heard from the vendors was that the tool that was being used to gather information before an RFP is actually issued was the RFI, the request for information. It's important to understand what the technology landscape looks like before you issue an RFP, because you might be issuing an RFP for something that doesn't exist and won't exist for the next 5 or 10 years, or something that's completely outdated. So you really want to understand what the solution space looks like to some degree before you issue an RFP. And the RFI theoretically would get at that, but what we heard from vendors was that the RFI was not a tool that was working well. There was vendor proprietary information that they wouldn't share, that RFI is a public document, and they would not want to share that information in that document. And so what we suggest or we recommend here is that beyond the RFI, We recommend that market research include things like one-on-one meetings with multiple vendors, so much more intimate engagement with vendors who live in that solution space beyond the RFI, so that when the agency does issue an RFP, it's a well-informed RFP that understands what the potential realistic solutions are.
Would these one-on-one meetings with multiple vendors also allow the state agency, or the procurement authority, I guess, to talk to vendors about prior experience, background, successes, and failures? Is that contemplated at this point, at this stage of the process, or is this stage primarily focused on making sure that what we're asking for exists?
It's both, and actually we have another recommendation further on in the document that gets at prior experiences with vendors, creating what we are calling a balanced scorecard to look at how vendors perform on their contract. But so to the first piece of it, yes, it is to try to get at what kind of possible technological solutions exist. Also looking at vendor relationships. Would this be a good partner for this particular agency? So there's a whole host of questions that are asked that are technical and related to technical, but there's also the chance to explore the prior history, if you will, of vendors. Do you want to speak to that? Because
Yes, I would. So the notion of market analysis is kind of embedded in procurement practice, but it's not always. The notion of market analysis is really embedded in procurement practice, and I say that because before becoming a chief information officer, I was a chief procurement officer in Alaska and a chief procurement official in Oregon, so I've got some background in the procurement side as well. But it doesn't always get used. And it's doubly important to use it in information technology, because the difficulty we have in information technology procurement is the technology is evolving so quickly that there's a lag in a lot of our practices and processes in the procurement process. So it's very important, particularly if it's a complicated project, to understand what your internal requirements are, to be thinking about what you really need, and then to take that and also understand what's available in the marketplace. Because what's there today is going to change 6 months from now or 18 months from now. So it really is important for an organization to do robust market analysis and have free and open dialogue. Sometimes procurement people will say, well, we are nervous about having that dialogue with vendors because people might think that we've gone this way or that way because we had this discussion with them. That's a big mistake when it comes to information technology. We talk about communications later in here, but at the front end of this process, a public agency wants to know what all the alternatives are. They want to be smart about what their business needs are, and they want to be smart about what's out there in the marketplace that would provide the best fit for what they're doing. Absent that, as Rocio said earlier, they're going to rely on what they've always done. And so that market analysis is really an important component here.
Well, in your task force study and review, did you discern that inside the state of California, procurement officials were generally reluctant to engage in this sort of market analysis with vendors pre-solicitation?
Our discussion led us to believe that it was not used in a very robust manner, and that it was, as Rocio said, we would put out a request for information, get some feedback, but wouldn't really have the give and take dialogue to find out, this is what we're thinking, will that work, what do you do, would this be a better approach or that approach? That information needs really to be thought through before the business case is completed. And if you're really going to be successful with the procurement, you want pretty good planning to go into the front end, including knowing what all your technology options are.
Now, did you, again, during your task force deliberations, did you discern that there were any statutory impediments in California to this sort of market analysis approach?
Well, I think there's a real the fear of a conflict of interest seemed to emerge quite often that made both sides, well, primarily on the state side, be very risk averse around engaging vendors. I think that was one thing that we
That's
heard
right.
quite often from both the vendors and the state staff that we interviewed.
I mean, that also goes to whether you ask a vendor if they've ever done it before and were they successful in doing it, or whether you just hope and pray that they have, and hope and pray that when they did, that they brought the
well.
project in somewhere around the timeline that it was supposed to be.
But we also have, maybe you can speak to this, the whole assessment of vendors that are
Yes.
later recommendations?
Yeah, towards the end of the report, we talk about doing a vendor assessment at the conclusion of the project to determine how they did, the scorecard, and then keeping track of that. One of the things we heard when we talked to the vendors that Rocio mentioned was that they care a lot about their reputation. And they want to be perceived as doing a great job for the organization. So if an organization is keeping track of that, evaluating on how they did against what the outcomes were to put into the project, and then feeding that back into an assessment when they begin to look at the vendors on the front end. We have, later on in the report, we talk about having pre-qualified vendors, using that to fit into that pre-qualification. Then you've got kind of a continuous cycle where you're keeping track of performance, you're keeping track of items like, did they shift from the A team to another team? Did they promise that they were going to give you the A team in the proposal, but then later on they've given you vendors that weren't, or they've given you staff that were substituted? Keeping track of that kind of thing in an objective way can then be built into an evaluation when you're awarding to a vendor on the front end, when you're looking at that pre-qualification.
I gather you didn't find that sort of system in place in California.
Well, it's a difficult system, Mr. Chairman, to put in place. That vendor past performance is what it's typically talked about is hard to make happen because sometimes vendors take exception to how they've been scored. And that can create a process in and of itself to making sure that they have appropriate redress and that your way of evaluating was transparent and open and objective. But it can be done. And frankly, to not take advantage of your knowledge of a vendor's performance, particularly if you collected it in your own state, it seems to me it is asking for trouble, particularly in this area of major IT projects.
And in the absence of such a vendor database, I guess, you would assume that at least there would be due diligence at the front end of the contracting process to ask vendors questions and potentially ask customers questions.
And typically that's the case. And in fact, in California, I'm sure that they have references and they contact the references, but oftentimes the references that you're given are going to be references that are going to give you a good report. And it's hard to go into the kind of depth to really get the sort of feedback necessary. And so the best way to do it is to collect it based upon your own experience.
See. Well, you also mentioned the use of a draft request for proposal that's solicited. I guess that's tied into the market research suggestion that the draft is floated, and then that would give vendors an opportunity to comment to allow the specifications to be adjusted if the
Right.
technology doesn't exist.
Right.
And does that tend to work in other states?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Massachusetts uses that heavily. A number of states will put a draft out. Other states will use a version where they'll give suppliers so much time to file an appeal of the specification to allow you to adjust the specification. That part of the process usually is tied to making sure that you get your RFP nailed down before it becomes the final RFP. And in some cases, the reason for that is because many states don't have the ability, it's kind of a vestige of the old invitation to bid process, but they don't have the ability to clarify when a proposer proposes a different term and condition. And so they'll have to reject them if they say, well, we can't accept this liability provision. Then the state will have to reject them as a non-responsive offer.
even though they could very well be the most qualified of the bidders.
Exactly right. And one of the things that I think California is leading on is that they passed a public contracting code, I think it's 6611, a few years back, which actually allows for some negotiations and clarifications, so they aren't put in a position where they have to reject somebody.
Did you find that, did you during your task force deliberations find that we're utilizing that code section 60, public contract code 6611 in our IT procurement process here?
At the time that we met, we found that California wasn't fully utilizing the flexibility that 6611 gave them. However, at that time, they were promulgating rules at that very time to broaden that process, and I think that they were out for comments from the vendor community on broadening the use of negotiations and giving more flexibility in the rulemaking. And we noted that in the report, and we supported that. Although we, I think, would be more aggressive in the task force in the use of discussions for clarifications or notification than what that rule had at the time. I think it extended it down to just for contracts over $20 million, and we would think that it could go for contracts lower than that. I think our report said $1 million should be one of the things that should be considered for use in negotiations.
Now, you had some recommendations with respect to governance and leadership in your task force report. And, of course, in California, I have my own personal view on this, but each department and agency appears to run its own information technology procurement, at least to some extent, process, at least managing those contracts with some role for what used to be called the California Technology Agency and now is our Department of Technology. And you talk about a governing body for each project, and I noted one, I may be paraphrasing here, but a single senior project executive is key to project success, which I guess I'd like your view on it in a state where we appear to have multiple hands in the pot working the same project.
Yeah, one of the things we heard quite often was that, especially from the vendors, excuse me, from the vendors, was that there was too many people can say no, and this caused delays in the project. This caused budget overruns, and what this, I think we call it the single throat to choke, was another thing we heard. So people were very averse.
Choke throats here,
right? So they were very averse to having that one throat because then you're responsible. And so what the
we don't like accountability either, apparently.
Right, and that's what that recommendation was getting at in particular, that there needed to be one person that would be accountable to make decisions. We also recommend that there be clear decision rights established early on. We have a whole series of recommendations around defining what the governance structure is like for the particular IT project. So there has to be clear definitions of who's responsible for making decisions and who's not.
And with respect to, you use the term issue escalation in your report, I noted, but there's also some discussion about quality assurance, quality control, and either the vendor, the contractor, or the person responsible for quality control, who that person reports to, and can you address that for us?
Right. I think one of the things that we found also too, that we wanted the senior executive person who's overseeing the project to have direct access to the vendors that are involved in the project. What we found was that the project, the state and the vendors work together very closely on a major project. They spend lots of time together, day in, day out, and sometimes develop a type of relationship where they feel that if something is going wrong, the vendors see something is going wrong, they don't feel that they have or want to call attention to any kind of problematic issues that have arisen, if it be around schedule or budget or whatever it may be. So we wanted to basically put in place a structure that would allow the vendors to go directly to the project executive and make known any kinds of issues or problems that were surfacing, and not feel that they were in some ways betraying their colleagues that they're working with on the project team.
And does it cut the other way too, where the state employees are reluctant to call out the vendor?
We didn't hear too much about that I can recall.
But we did provide some guidance on contract administration, contract management, and making, and so it is important to.
By separating the contract management function, as I recall, later on in the report.
Right.
Very much.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, just a quick
Absolutely.
question. We've heard, and it is regressing a little bit, but when it comes to taking a look at these big IT projects and stuff, that we've heard a lot about what other states do and whatnot. I guess we've gone through the 6611 code. That's what we've done. So is that what we do here in California? How do we do it? And I guess I'm asking, as we move forward, is that still a viable, or should we be looking at something else?
Chairman Roth, Senator Berryhill, I think that's a great question. I think you made terrific progress over many states who haven't really moved beyond information or ITBs for information technology. So that notion of negotiation, clarification, even after award, to make sure that contracts can be adjusted to get the project completed effectively, makes good sense to me. But as I said earlier, technology is really moving quickly. It's evolving much faster than our reactionary procurement processes are. And so what we're finding is that there are new business models and technologies out there that some of these procurement approaches don't even contemplate. And so elsewhere in the report, we've suggested using alternative procurements, evaluating them, do lessons learned on it, and look to make changes by inventorying how well you've done and using the best practice models you can find anywhere. So what I'm saying to you, and you may be frustrated with this answer, but I don't think anybody's got this quite right when it comes to procurement and information technology. We have what I think one of the most progressive things in the country going on in Philadelphia, where they're doing an incubator they'll define the business problem, and then they'll invite technologists in to develop a solution. They'll pilot those solutions, kind of test them, and then if they seem to work right, they'll write a contract for it. But that's all new, and that's innovative work that's happening. But I think that's the kind of thing we're going to see in the future when we're looking at figuring out how we match up with some of the technology solutions that are out there today.
Yeah, we're kind of damned if we do, damned if we don't in this state. It looks to me like, I mean, we are such a big state, a mini nation, if you will, baby nation, that even if you do all the stuff that we're talking about today, in all likelihood, by the time you get this stuff engaged, it's antiquated. So, I mean, everything's changing very quickly. So, it's as we move forward and as we try to fix some of the problems that we've currently got, we've got to have some maybe we got to break this stuff up a little bit. I don't know, and I'd like your maybe a couple comments on whether or not that's the way to go.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Berryhill, we do talk in the report about modular procurements, and that really is a complement from the procurement side to agile development of projects on the project side, which breaks down some of these projects into smaller pieces. So you've mitigated the risk substantially, because if you have a failure, it's a smaller failure, and it in many ways drives innovation. You can have it done right, multiple contractors, so you always have kind of a competitive alternative, but it also has some risk associated with it too, because you really have to understand your architecture, your overarching architecture for the technology, because if you will, you're buying modules that have to plug and play. And if they don't plug and play right, you've got a problem with the system as well. So there are solutions out there that should be contemplated once you've kind of done the market research, understand what your requirements are. Then you should really take the scan of what's the best procurement methodology to acquire this. And we talk about developing an acquisition strategy. That ought to be keyed to what's out there in the market and what your needs are and what your requirements are to give you the best shot at getting the outcomes that the state needs.
It almost seems to me what we're talking about here is not government's not good at. That what you're just explaining to me sounds like something that the private sector would do better because they're more accountable. They can change quicker than we can in government.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Berryhill, some of the pre-reading we did, we went through several Standish reports about IT project failures, and frankly, the failure rate on the government side, it isn't so much different than what it is on the private sector side. It is much more public on the government side. So, government works hard, and these are difficult projects that have to be done with transparency and public accountability that are played out if they go wrong in the newspaper. Very few private projects operate under that kind of situation. So it creates, where it really is different, is it creates oftentimes a very risk-adverse culture inside a government. So they don't want to do these innovative things because the fear of failure becomes so great.
But I'll tell you, one of the differences is in government and in the private sector is that the private sector, you don't want to go to litigation. You want to fix these things. Government, it's not their money, and it's unless you're earning that money, you don't understand how hard it is to earn. And we have a tendency at the state level just to litigate stuff. I mean, I think we're going through that right now in the SAP and controllers problem. And I think that the state would be much better off if we could sit down and kind of work these differences out. We can always litigate. That's the one thing that we've got going for us here in California. We can always do that. But to be able to sit down and to have everybody vent how they're going to, we haven't heard from SAP. We don't know how they're even going to fix it. We've heard that from the controller's office that they've had many discussions with them. Well, that's all well and good. We haven't. Yes. And so I would love to have the opportunity to sit down with everybody, even behind closed doors, and just say, hey, what can we or can't we do?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Berryhill, if I might reply, it always is difficult once you are in a lawsuit setting. But if you look ahead to our recommendation 21, we agree with the communication. In fact, one of the things that we said in this report is that the procurement authority, and at the time the procurement authority hadn't shifted to the California Technology Authority yet, but we said that they should review from cradle to grave the procurement process to build as much communication into that process as possible. Because what happens oftentimes in the procurement process is sometimes agencies don't communicate, suppliers don't get answers, they invent answers because they have to have some answer to move forward on. And if you have a major information technology project, millions of dollars on the table, you want a good partnership between your state organization and the vendor. You want them working together towards success. And you don't have a good partnership, just like you don't have a good marriage, if you don't have communication. And it starts at the end and it goes all the way through the project. And so one of the things that we think would make a great deal of sense is to take a look at the procurement statutes and the procurement rules and ask where you can build in that kind of dialogue and communication, because that'll lead to better outcomes in our judgment.
Well, again, I know this has been a lengthy hearing, but thanks for your time today. I do appreciate it.